historic Reichstag building will also be addressed by the Bundestag president and a Holocaust survivor, 87-year-old Dr. Inga Auerbacher, who was born in Germany and survived 3 years in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Meanwhile, however, Jewish leaders are already warning that in light of a sharp rise in anti-Semitism and the overall global climate nowadays, the lessons of the past must be reiterated day to day. Here's the chairman of European Jewish Congress, Dr. Moshe Kanto.
In times of political and economic uncertainty, people look for simplistic solutions to questions for which they do not have answers. It is no accident that in the midst of pandemic, extremists are spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories about Jews or the state of Israel. This shows us that we cannot rest for 1 minute.
Let's cross now live to Berlin, where our Polina Garayev is at. Polina, hello. Well, the ceremony, the special plenary session is about to begin. What can you tell us?
Well, it is, of course, a very special occasion, an opportunity for Germany to remember its history and, most importantly, to iterate its commitment to the memory of the Holocaust, to making sure that anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism remain a priority for this government and future governments. The main event that we'll see today, we'll hear speeches, as you mentioned, by a Holocaust survivor. We'll also hear a speaker of the Knesset take the podium for the first time during such an event. There are also other ceremonies taking place all across Germany's local communities that are marking this occasion. Many of the events, unfortunately, are happening online because of the pandemic. One noteworthy initiative is one for the University of Tübingen that recently discovered that the remains of thousands of Holocaust victims were used in the science department of the university. A particular project was devoted to learning their histories, learning the biographies of those victims, and those details are today being published online for people to learn about the individuals that suffered such injustices. We are going to hear a lot about the Holocaust and mostly what it means today in the media today, and also, of course, it's very present in the streets. The main government buildings and also the main train station in Berlin will be illuminated later today with the writing "We Remember," the campaign of the World Jewish Congress. Germany is also taking part, and of course here the words "We Remember" mean more than even in other countries.
Right, and Polina, we have seen a shift in power as incoming Chancellor Scholz replaced former Chancellor Angela Merkel. What have we been hearing from the new Chancellor in this respect?
Well, it's clear, of course, Chancellor Angela Merkel was a close friend of Israel and on numerous occasions expressed her commitment to both Israel's security and the fight against anti-Semitism. This is something that, of course, will not change under the new government. And despite any sort of political differences, and the new chancellor does come from a different party that at times was more critical of Israel. But when it comes to remembering the Holocaust, there's no doubt that this commitment will continue, and we did hear from the new Chancellor Olaf Scholz, also before he was elected and later, reiterate this commitment, and of course also repeats Merkel's famous saying that Israel's security and of course the fight against anti-Semitism are part of Germany's reason of being, state reason.
Yes, Polina Garayev for us in Berlin. Thank you. We'll speak to you later on in the broadcast again. And with me here in studio, former Israeli ambassador to France and political commentator, Ambassador Daniel Sheck, and in our Tel Aviv studio, senior correspondent Owen Alterman. Ambassador Sheck, as Polina mentioned, rising anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is timely every year to an extent when we're marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But this year, it seems that in the aftermath of the Texas synagogue hostage attack and in Europe, when we're talking about the political climate there, it is even more pressing.
Well, I think that there is an important parallel to be drawn between the unfortunate universality of anti-Semitism and the universality of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was instituted in 2005 through a UN General Assembly resolution. And its importance to my mind is that it is a moment of remembrance, not just for the victims. It's not just for the victims or their descendants. It is a universal Remembrance Day, and it is there to remind the world, including the countries who participated in the nations who participated in these terrible crimes, or other nations who just stood by and did nothing about these events. So I think, yes, you're right in saying that if anti-Semitism is growing, then remembering the terrifying consequences of anti-Semitism is just as important.
And if I understand correctly, you're alluding there to Poland, perhaps most notably in recent months or in the past year. We are seeing already live images from the Bundestag where the ceremony will begin shortly. We can see the dignitaries entering the big hall. As said, the chairman of the Bundestag will speak there, Israeli parliament speaker and a Holocaust survivor who was born in Germany. Let's go now to our Owen Alterman in our Tel Aviv studios. Owen, speak to us a bit about the importance of this special plenary session that is taking place annually in Germany, and also connect us to the political climate in Berlin nowadays.
Yeah, well, first of all, Ellie, just to take off something that Daniel Scheck was saying, this project of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's not that old. It only came out in 2005, as Ambassador Scheck said, through the General Assembly resolution. And look at how much of a tremendous success it's become. The list of ceremonies happening across Europe, in the United States, in Israel and beyond is breathtaking. And of course, for Jews and for Israelis, it has to be said the more important and resonant Holocaust Day is the one in the spring that has been marked on the Israeli calendar since the 1950s. But this has certainly taken its place on the international calendar year in and year out. And I have to say, it's really inspiring and encouraging to see just how much importance is devoted to this around the world. And of course, who can forget that ceremony 2 years ago at Yad Vashem on the eve of the pandemic, which brought in leaders and heads of state and heads of government from so many countries here. A magnificent event, if that word is even appropriate, that was hosted here in Israel in conjunction with International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As for the ceremony in Germany, look, Ellie, as I often say on our broadcast, the post-Holocaust culture in Germany is something that's just incredibly impressive, and we're going to see it on display again in just a few minutes. But we've seen it not only today, not only on Holocaust Remembrance Day, but it has to be said on every single day of the year in Germany over the course of decades, as the country has done so much to come to terms with its legacy. You're right, there is a new chancellor, but this shows just how much of a consensus this is.
Yes, absolutely, Owen. We will make a stop there and join the live ceremony in Berlin and continue the discussion afterwards.
High-ranking civil servants and National Socialist Party officials met. The topic of the meeting was the final solution to the Jewish question. All those in attendance were aware of what this meant. The mass murder had commenced much earlier. The objective was to discuss how to make this mass murder systematic, accelerate it, and expand it to encompass the whole of Europe, to encompass 11 million Jews. None of the meeting's attendees registered any concerns. We remember the victims of the National Socialist crimes, the murdered Jews, the Sinti and Roma who died, the victims amongst the Slavic peoples. We remember the millions of people who were persecuted, dispossessed, humiliated, deprived of their rights, tortured or left to die because they thought differently, worshipped differently, loved differently, or because their lives were classified by the Nazis as unworthy. The Wannsee Conference stands for a state in which injustice was legalized, for a state which planned, organized, and administered the crime. This state was underpinned by individual people, people who became murderers and accomplices. So today is also a day of shame. Shame for what previous generations of Germans did. A shame never shown by the perpetrators. Far too few of them were held accountable by the courts. Far too many of them escaped with sentences so mild as to be an insult to the victims. And that included participants in the Wannsee conference. My dear Ms. Auerbacher, you stand before us today as a witness of a time which, for most of us, is consigned to history. It seems far away and completely unimaginable. When you were 7 years old, you were deported with your parents to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. This was the day on which your childhood ended. Approximately 1.5 million Jewish children died in the Holocaust. And in one of your books, you write that you feel these 3 million eyes on you. And you appeal that they should not be forgotten. And making this appeal has become your vocation. Over the past years and decades, you've told your story on numerous occasions, particularly to children and young people, to ensure that they do not forget. I would like to thank you for making the trip from New York, and I know it was not easy, particularly under the difficult circumstances of the pandemic. So thank you for coming to speak to us today and telling us your story. We are honoured to have you here with us.
When Inge Auerbacher's
family received the so-called emigration order to deport them, her birthplace, Kippenheim, had already been declared in Nazi jargon to be free of Jews. Almost all of the Jews from Baden, the Palatinate and Saarland had been deported to the Gurs camp in the non-occupied part of France in October 1940. This was one of the first mass deportations of German Jews. And all of this took place in broad daylight. And, as the responsible officials duly reported back, it went off for the Main without incident. Today, the restored synagogue in Kippenheim is a remembrance, education and meeting centre. It is run by citizens on a voluntary basis. And it is also thanks to the dedication of a local group that the house of Inge Auerbacher's grandparents in Jebenhausen was able to be preserved. And that today it is part of a path of remembrance commemorating former Jewish life in Göppingen. As a representative of all the dedicated local people, I would like to welcome the Mayor of Göppingen, Mr. Alex Meyer. Our culture of remembrance and commemoration is reliant on initiatives like this. In these active citizens and associations which take care of remembrance sites, as well as school pupils who embark on voyages of discovery about the past. A culture of remembrance is not something which can be imposed from the top downwards, and it is not confined to state rituals like this annual act of remembrance, at least not in a free and democratic society. Remembrance evolves. With the passing of time, there are less and less witnesses able to give first-hand testimony. More and more people living here do not have German ancestors, and Germany's horrific 20th century history is not their history. That makes the work of schools, remembrance sites and museums all the more important. Our culture of remembrance, which has earned respect from many quarters, can only remain vibrant if we continually ask questions of our history and seek answers. And that applies particularly to young people. And it also means being able to accept different perspectives and discussing reference points of the histories of others. As long as we do this, and the debates take place in a sensitive, responsible and respectful fashion. So I'm particularly saddened by the fact that we have had to postpone the German Bundestag's youth encounter due to the pandemic. But of course we will reschedule it as soon as possible. The youth encounter brings together young people from different countries with different life experiences and different life stories. And they are united by one thing, by their belief that what happened must never be repeated. Antisemitism, misanthropy and racism have no place in our society, neither today nor in the future. Our country bears a special responsibility. The genocide of the European Jews is a German crime. Yet it is also a past which is relevant to all, not only Germans and not only Jews. And that is why the Bundestag, together with other European parliaments, is participating in the social media We Remember campaign. Together with many others worldwide, we are taking a stance on remembrance of the Holocaust, a stance against xenophobia and antisemitism. But merely taking a stance is not enough. I welcome the President of the Knesset, Mr. Miki Levy.
Wir freuen uns, dass Sie bei uns sind. Ihr Besuch
It is a pleasure to have you with us today. And your visit underlines the close and special ties between the parliaments of our countries. 70 years after Konrad Adenauer and Ben Gurion signed the Luxembourg Agreement, which provided for reparations for something which cannot be repaired. Looking back, reconciliation between Germany and Israel seems miraculous, a precious gift which must be cultivated. Germany and Israel do not agree on everything, but they are nevertheless true partners, as emphasized by the then Israeli President Rivlin 2 years ago when he spoke here. We are united not least by the shared values to which we are committed and which are partly grounded in the lessons learnt from history. And that applies particularly to the battle against antisemitism. We in politics and society have been engaged in this battle for many years. We have created commissions and commissioners to deal with antisemitism. And we have innumerable civil society initiatives and groups. And we've tightened up provisions under criminal law. We warn of the dangers and make clear that antisemitism is not acceptable. Full stop, no matter how it is expressed.
Egal wo herkommt,
no matter where it comes from, never again must anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudice be allowed to take hold. Never again must Jews be made responsible for the evils of the world. Never again must anti-Semitism pave the way for exclusion, hatred, and a fanatical ideology of extermination. This ceremony of remembrance is also part of our commitment, because we remember in order to counter any threat of repetition, as stated in the original proclamation on this day of remembrance. Yet remembrance and commemoration do not create immunity to anti-Semitism, nor do they safeguard against racism and right-wing extremism. They did not prevent the murderous terrorism of the NSU, nor the anti-Semitic attack in Halle, nor the right-wing extremist murders in Hanau. And knowledge of history has not prevented 1/3 of the German population believing that the Jews might indeed have too great an influence, and has not prevented 70% of people from agreeing or partially agreeing that Israeli policy in the Middle East, and I quote, is as bad as that of the Nazis in the Second World War, and it has not prevented the pandemic from further stoking the hatred of Jews which was already rife. So anti-Semitism is there, and it is to be found not only on the extreme margins, not only amongst intransigent diehards and a few anti-Semitic trolls on the internet. It is a problem of our society, of society as a whole. Anti-Semitism is to be found in our midst.
Wir müssen uns ehrlich befragen, auch jene,
we must ask ourselves honestly,
Antisemiten halten,
including those of us who identify as committed anti-Semites. How free are we really from anti-Jewish cliches?
für die israelische Politik
Do we always manage not to hold Jews responsible for Israeli policy?
Toleranz zu
And do misguided notions of tolerance lead us to be overly indulgent towards the anti-Semitism which some immigrants have brought with them from their own home countries?
das vielschichtige jüdische Leben,
And do we actually notice the multifaceted German life, which, fortunately, once again exists in Germany?
jüdische Deutsche und deutsche
The diversity of contemporary Jewish life, encompassing German
junge Israel
Jews and Jewish Germans, Orthodox and liberal Jews, young Israelis and Jewish families from the former Soviet Union.
Juden gibt es nicht.
For the Jews do not exist,
Deutschen gibt.
just as the Germans do not exist. The refugees or the Muslims do not exist.
Wer gegen Muslime und ihren Glauben
And incidentally, anybody who incites hatred of Muslims and their faith undermines their own credibility as a friend of Judaism.
Wer Menschen bei uns ablehnt, weil
Anybody who rejects people amongst us because they are different or simply because they've not always been here should certainly not use the word freedom in this context.
die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar.
Human dignity is inviolable, the dignity of every human.
Geprägt.
The lessons drawn from history shaped our constitution,
Freie Gesellschaften
and we know from experience that free societies remain vulnerable on the inside.
zur Intoleranz
So that is why we need courage to show intolerance towards those who want to use democracy to destroy it. And that is why we need that. Those are not my words.
als ein Vater des Grundgesetzes.
They are the drastic words of Carlo Schmitt, one of the architects of the German constitution, the Basic Law.
Unsere freiheitliche Demokratie muss sich wappnen gegen
Our liberal democracy must be able to defend itself against those who repeatedly invoke democracy, but actually only mean their own freedom,
für sich einfordern,
who emphasize their own right to tolerance,
übrig haben.
while showing only contempt for pluralism, who spread lies in order to sow the seeds of doubt, incite hatred and violence,
Zu distanzieren.
only to later distance themselves with expressions of outrage.
Hat dafür nichts übrig.
The majority in our country has no time for this. They will not allow themselves to be enticed into violence. They vote democratically and debate democratically. And they are often passionate in these debates, sometimes even fierce.
Zur Intoleranz.
In our approach to the others, we need more courage to show intolerance,
Die wehrhafte Demokratie
the resolute use of all means at the disposal of a resilient democracy. When right-wing extremists, historical revisionists, and ethno-nationalists celebrate election victories,
allerhöchste Zeit.
it is not a warning sign. It is a sign that it is high time to take action.
Dann ist es höchste Zeit, zusammenzustehen,
High time to stand together
Institutionen,
to defend the values and institutions of our free democratic society.
denn die Demokratie trägt kein Ewigkeitssiegel.
For democracy bears no eternal seal.
Auf Bürgerinnen und Bürger
It is reliant on citizens who value it and bring it to life.
daran erinnern uns dieser Tag und die
And this is also one of the lessons which we are reminded of on this day and by German history.
sehr
We are
geehrten
reminded that it is up to all of us.
deutschen Rassen waren
Ladies and gentlemen,
vielfältige, über Jahrhunderte
a diverse culture which had grown over centuries was destroyed by murderous German fanatical racism. This impoverished Europe. Scientists, intellectuals and artists were forced out,
vertrieben,
went into exile, lost their lives.
ums Leben. Einer von ihnen ist der Prager
One of them was the composer from Prague, Hans Krasser. His children's opera Brundibar was misused by the Nazis for their propaganda in Theresienstadt concentration camp. It was there that Hans Krasser also wrote the string trio piece that we're about to hear. He died in 1944 in Auschwitz. I would like to thank the musicians from the Prague operas. I would like to thank Joet Suet, the cantor, and I would also like to thank all the other musicians and artists who have been involved in this ceremony of remembrance. After the music is finished, Ms. Auerbacher, you have the word. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Yes, and these were the remarks of Ms. Barbel Bass, the chairwoman of the German parliament, the Bundestag. As we continue to, of course, monitor the ceremony in Berlin, let's cross now back to Polina Garayev standing by for us. Polina, very impressive speech by the chairwoman of the Bundestag. For me, what stood was really the definition that anti-Semitism does not come just from right-wing elements, extreme right-wing elements, or from the extreme left, but rather at the very middle, the very consensus of the political landscape. What are your takes from this speech?
Definitely. Barbel Bass provided a comprehensive and an alarming image of what anti-Semitism means in Germany of nowadays. And as you said, it's not only violent acts that are committed by the far right, also should be added to the list of heinous acts that you mentioned is a suspected plot against the synagogue in the city of Hagen near Düsseldorf this past Yom Kippur that was suspected to have an Islamist motivation. This was, of course, was foiled just 1 year after the attack on a synagogue in Halle that had a neo-Nazi motivation. And of course, there also, and Barbel Bass mentioned that in the comment that was directed at the far-right populist AfD party, that there are many forms of hate that are being experienced in Germany nowadays. But we're not only talking about violence. It's simply the idea that being Jewish makes you different in German society, makes you less German, or makes you different in any other way. This is something that we have seen also in demonstrations by opponents to COVID restrictions, by anti-vaxxers who are trying to appropriate Holocaust-related symbols, trying to compare their treatment by the government to how the Jews were persecuted by the Nazis at those times. This, of course, speaks to
yes.
As something that can be utilized for personal use in order to make a point. And this is, of course, something that Germany cannot stand for. And this is why Barbel Bass spoke of the need to look at oneself and with one's own attitudes and see where perhaps one possesses views that see Jews as different. This also, of course, echoes the message that we've seen published ahead of this day by the Central Council of Jews in Germany that mentioned the need to back such claims that never again should the prosecution of Jews take place on German soil, not only with words but also with deeds. And they also mentioned very specific actions that the German government can take in order to realize this. One of those things is adding anti-Semitism commissioners to all the public prosecutor's office in all the German states. This is something that is happening slowly but unevenly across Germany. It also spoke of the need to educate judges about Nazi injustices, and also, of course, teachers should be given training about how to curb anti-Semitism in schools, which is, of course, a major problem.
Yes, Polina Garayev, thank you very much for this, and of course we continue to watch the ceremony at the Bundestag. But let's go back to studio now. Ambassador Daniel Sheikh, echoing what we've heard from Polina, and of course the chairwoman of the German parliament. Let's talk a bit about the consensus to an extent that anti-Semitism has become, and more so, we've mentioned earlier in the broadcast the issue of the Texas synagogue attack, the sporadicness in which targets against Jews, or Jewish targets rather, are being used. President Joe Biden defined this attack as a terror attack, with the attacker himself not conveying clear sentiments against Jews specifically, but it is yet the go-to spot when one wishes to make a provocation.
Well, you know, there's a difference between Europe and the United States in the sense that Europe has a very sad tradition of century-old anti-Semitism with rises and falls, whereas the United States has less of a habit in treating this. So. But unfortunately, I believe the developments of the last few years, both with violent incidents, but also with a broadening expression of what some people call a cultural anti-Semitism, a sort of a low-key, diffuse kind of anti-Semitic sentiment within American society. These are becoming more and more widespread and need to be addressed very seriously. The United States is no longer immune to this terrible phenomenon.
Yeah, and the rise of conspiracy theories, let it be due to the political climate in the States, or obviously the COVID pandemic, is definitely boosting
yes,
that.
Because in moments of crisis anywhere in the world, it always makes the ugliest parts of human nature come to the surface. And when that happens, anti-Semitism is never very far away.
Yes, well, we are seeing the Holocaust survivor, Dr. Inge Auerbacher, taking the podium now. We will tune in back to the ceremony at the German capital to hear her speech now.
Guten Morgen.
Good morning.
Sehr verehrte Frau Bundespräsidentin Baas.
Madam President of the Bundestag, Mrs. Baas.
Herr Knesset-Präsident Levy.
Mr. Speaker of the Knesset, Mr. Levy.
Herr Abgeordnete Dr. Schäuble.
Dr. Schäuble.
Abgeordnete und Gäste des deutschen
members of the German Bundestag,
meine
guests,
Damen und Herren.
ladies and gentlemen.
Ich danke herzlich für die Einladung.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Ich bin ein
So, who am I? I am a Jewish girl from the village of Kippenheim in Baden and from Jebenhausen-Göppingen in Swabia. I was born on December the 31st, 1934 in Kippenheim. Jews and Christians lived together in peace. I was the last Jewish child to be born there, the only child of Berthold and Regina Auerbacher. Papa served in the German army in World War I and was badly wounded. He was a decorated soldier. He was awarded the Iron Cross. By profession, he was a textile merchant. Mama was from Jebenhausen in Swabia. Her mother, my grandma, was from a large family. She was one of 14 children. 4 of her brothers fought in World War I, and 2 of them gave their lives to the German fatherland. My grandma of blessed memory was murdered by the Nazis. She is buried in a mass grave in Birkeniki forest near Riga in Latvia. Bertold Auerbach, his real name was Moses Baruch Auerbacher, was a member of my family, one of my relatives, and in the 19th century he was a celebrated writer. Today there is a street named after him in Berlin. New York has been my home for 75 years, but I still have very clear memories of that dark time, a time of terror and hate. Sadly, this cancer has returned, and hatred of the Jews has become commonplace again in many countries of the world, including Germany. This disease needs to be eradicated as swiftly as possible. We were a happy little community in Kippenheim until something happened to disturb the peace of our quiet village. On November the 9th and 10th, 1938, riots and violence erupted against the Jewish people across Germany. Today, those events are known as the Night of Broken Glass. In Kippenheim, there was a pogrom on November the 10th. I was not even 4 years old at the time. Nazi hoodlums threw bricks through our windows. I was nearly hit by one of those stones. Our synagogue was not burnt down. There were Christian houses in the neighborhood, and there was a risk that they might catch fire as well. All men and boys from the age of 16 were sent to concentration camps. My grandpa and papa were deported to the concentration camp at Dachau, where they were held in Block 16. Weeks later, they were released and came back home. They told us terrible stories of the torture and abuse they had suffered. It was quite clear that it was time to leave Germany. We sold our house in Kippenheim in 1939, and Papa lost his business. We moved in with my grandparents in Jebenhausen, hoping that we would soon be able to emigrate. But where to? The doors for emigration were closing very rapidly. Soon afterwards, my grandpa died of a broken heart. New anti-Semitic laws and decrees were being issued all the time, all targeting the Jews. And yet, many of the residents of Jebenhausen remained our loyal friends, even though it was forbidden for Christians and neighbors to have any contact with Jews. Some of the farmers sometimes gave us food as well. And most children still played with me. Then I turned 6, and it was time for me to go to school. By now, Jewish children were not allowed to attend the local public school anymore. I had to walk the 3 kilometers to Göppingen and then spend 1 hour on the train to Stuttgart, where there was a Jewish school. It was the only Jewish school in the region. I had to get special permission to travel, as Jews no longer had any freedom of movement. At first, my father took me to school. Later, my parents had to work as slave laborers in a factory in Göppingen, and so I traveled to school on my own. The journey to school became even more dangerous after September the 1st, 1941, as all Jews aged 6 and over had to wear the yellow star. I was taunted and harassed by some of the Christian children. One day, a woman left a little bag of bread rolls right next to my seat. She must have seen that I was wearing the yellow star and felt some compassion for the little Jewish girl who was sitting all alone on the train. The deportations to the east began at the end of 1941. My grandma and most of the children from the Jewish school were deported to Riga in Latvia. The school in Stuttgart was soon forced to close before I could finish first grade. We had to leave my grandparents' house in Jebenhausen and move into a Jewish house in Göppingen. In August 1942, my parents and I and other Jews were told to assemble in the school gymnasium at the Schillerschule in Göppingen. All our belongings were searched. One of the guards saw that I was wearing a little wooden pin, which he liked the look of, and he tore it off me. In a harsh voice, he told me, "You won't need this where you're going." It sounds a bit different in Swabian. He said it in Swabian. And I had my doll in my arms, and he ripped her from me too, and looked inside her hollow body to see if I was hiding anything there. There were tears streaming down my face. I was so happy when he handed Marlene, my doll, back to me. From Göppingen, we were sent to the Killesberg transit camp in Stuttgart. Then, on August the 22nd, 1942, we were put on a transport made up of Jewish people from Württemberg and sent to the Theresienstadt or Terezin concentration camp. I was 7 years old at the time, the youngest in the transport of around 1,100 Jews. My parents and I were among the very few who survived. We were on the train for about 2 days. It was still a passenger train, very crowded, and finally we arrived at the station in Auschwitz. The first thing we heard were the guards yelling at us, "Drop everything except your bedroll and metal dishes. Get going. March. Do as you're told." We were surrounded by guards with whips. My parents put me between them, so I was protected from the blows. I was holding on to my doll for dear life. We walked about 3 kilometers. For the older people, it was a very long and difficult journey on foot. Finally, we passed through an entrance arch into a garrison, very large. Our quarters were located on the top story. We had no beds, there was just the cold floor. It was very, very overcrowded. Theresienstadt, or Terezin, consisted of vast red brick barracks and old run-down houses. The concentration camp was totally sealed off from the outside world by high walls, wooden fences and barbed wire. Contact with anyone outside was strictly forbidden. On October the 10th, 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann and other Nazi high-ups had decided that Theresienstadt should serve as a transit camp for Jews before they were sent onwards to their deaths. In 1944, the Nazis beautified the camp for propaganda purposes and called it a model ghetto. It was all for show, an elaborate hoax staged solely for the inspection by the International Red Cross. The camp inmates came from all over Europe. They were older people, prominent people, and many were highly decorated veterans of World War I. Life in the Theresienstadt concentration camp was especially difficult for such a young child. There was no escape. There were only the gas chambers at Auschwitz, starvation, suicide, or death from disease. Most families, men, women and children, had to live separately from one another, but they could still see each other. Luckily, I was allowed to stay with my parents in the quarters assigned to the disabled war veterans. We slept on sacks of straw, crowded together on 2- or 3-tier bunks. We children became independent very quickly. The most important words in our vocabulary were bread, potatoes, and soup. Life revolved entirely around food. The bathrooms were just latrines, far away. Very occasionally, we were allowed to take a shower. Our playground was a foul-smelling garbage dump. We rummaged around here for hours, hoping to find a treasure. A rotten turnip, or some potato skin. If it was still edible, we would cut a little bit off to eat. School was forbidden for us children. Classes were held in secret, and we were taught some basic reading and writing skills. This was called keeping ourselves busy. I made a bed for my doll out of a dirty cardboard box, which I kept at the end of the top bunk where I slept alongside my parents. One day, I found a dead mouse in the box, another victim of starvation. There were frequent epidemics caused by the lack of sanitation and the overcrowded conditions that we had to live in. Typhus was one of the worst dangers we faced. Rats, mice, fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Those were our constant companions. There were also frequent deportations, mostly to Auschwitz. In 1944, all the disabled war veterans had to report in alphabetical order to the commandant's office. They had no idea that this was a selection for deportation to Auschwitz. We shared our room with a family named Abraham from Berlin. They had a daughter, Ruth Nelly, who was exactly my age and who was an only child, just like me. Her father had been wounded in World War I and walked with a limp. So both our fathers were summoned to the commandant's office at the same time. A few weeks later, all 3 members of the Abraham family were deported to the east. By a miracle, we were left behind. Ruth and I were like sisters, and we promised to visit each other. She would come to Jebenhausen, and I would go to Berlin. Dear Ruth, I am here in Berlin. I have come to visit you. Ruth and her parents were murdered in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. She didn't even make it to her 10th birthday. On the 8th of May 1945, we were liberated by the Russian army, and our misery finally ended. Out of the 140,000 people who were sent to Theresienstadt, 33,000 died there, and 88,000 were murdered, mostly in Auschwitz or at other camps. 15,000 children passed through the Theresienstadt camp, and very few of them survived. Miraculously, I am one of them. Let me add something. I'm wearing a butterfly here today, and it's not only a piece of jewelry. A Czech boy, Pavel Friedman, wrote a poem in Terezin. He wrote, "I never saw a butterfly again." And this symbol, the butterfly, is a symbol for the 1.5 million Jewish children who were killed. So we always wear this butterfly. And I'm wearing it today, especially here at the German Bundestag.
Die Stadt Stuttgart holte die wenigen Überlebenden ab.
The city of Stuttgart sent a bus to pick up the few survivors. We went back to Göppingen, but only stayed there for 9 months. In May 1946, we emigrated to New York. I was 11 years old. My parents found work with a well-to-do family. My mother as a maid and my father as a butler. To me, America felt like Wonderland. Sadly, though, my dream was about to end. I had a very bad cough, so I was taken to the doctor. After he examined me, he told my parents, "Your daughter is very sick. She has tuberculosis in both lungs. She has to go to hospital right away." The doctor told my parents that the disease was caused by the 3 years in the concentration camp, where I had been undernourished and lived in filthy conditions. I was placed in a community hospital. I could hardly believe it. I thought, I am being locked up again. This can't be true. My face was awash with tears. I had to spend 2 years in bed and undergo painful medical examinations. Finally, my parents said, it's enough. They had found an apartment in Brooklyn by that time, and they took me home. Within a few months, however, I was in an even worse state than before, with bleeding in my lungs and very weak. I prayed to God, please, don't let me die. I want to live. By a miracle, a new drug came out, streptomycin, the first antibiotic that was effective against tuberculosis. A Nobel Prize was awarded for its discovery. I had to stay in bed for another year, but I was so thankful because those painful injections of streptomycin cured me. Finally, aged 15, I started school, and I finished high school in 3 instead of 4 years. I was very interested in science, so I went to college to study chemistry. After a few years, I got sick again. I had to spend another 12 months in bed and take 26 pills a day and 2 shots of streptomycin. Then, at last, I went back to college and completed my studies. For 38 years, I pursued a career as a chemist in medical research and clinical work. To sum up, as far as I know, I am the only child survivor who was deported from Stuttgart to the concentration camps. 20 members of our family were murdered by the Nazis. I spent 3 years in the Theresienstadt concentration camp. I endured 4 years of bed rest due to the severe effects this had on my health. I lost 8 years of schooling and suffered 4 years of stigmatization from having to wear a yellow star, as well as stigma because of the pernicious disease, which deterred partners from marrying me. I never got to wear a wedding dress. I will never be a mum or a grandma. But I'm happy. The children of the world are my family. I would like to conclude by sharing what my heart desires the most. Hatred against people is terrible. We are all born as brothers and sisters. My greatest wish is reconciliation among all people. So light a candle today to remember the murdered, innocent children, women, and men. Light a candle to celebrate life and hold back the darkness. Take care of your sisters and brothers, then you will always be blessed. We are all born as children of God. The gates to unity and peace are opening. The past must never be forgotten. Together, let us pray for unity on earth. Together, let us welcome a new tomorrow. And never, never, never lose sight of this dream. Thank you very much.
Wow, what a speech, what a woman, what a generation, what a just standing ovation now at the German parliament. Still with me here in studio, Ambassador Daniel Sheikh. Daniel, both of us were glued to the screen listening to this remarkable woman. And again, a remarkable generation, truly. Both you and I know it from very up close. Again, her speech continues to resonate in me, I'm sure with you as well. What are your main takeaways?
Listen, such a powerful woman, such a powerful recounting of a story that we've heard so many times. Right. And, you know, on a personal note, both my parents were in Theresienstadt, and they're both... were both among the very few survivors of that camp. So I know all the subject matter by heart, but still, to hear such a clearly visualized memory, together with a very clear vision of what the future is. Right. The fact that such a woman who grew up as a small child in the worst imaginable conditions, became such a productive, vital, energized woman with such a 87 years old, and look how much energy she had. What a career as a scientist! What a career as a human being, and who was able.
What a phrase! A career as a human being.
As many other survivors found the strength not to just hate humankind for what had happened, but to put some faith in a better future. That is amazing.
And this is perhaps what we're lacking so fundamentally nowadays. It feels time and time again. The Israeli Speaker of Parliament, Miki Levy, will take the podium soon. He will speak in Hebrew. While in Berlin on this day, the symbolic aspect of all of it, really, we don't need to say much. But I would like us to talk a bit about what I would dare to define as success in terms of the consensus surrounding the international remembrance of Holocaust and the ability to differentiate it from criticism towards Israel that we are seeing often, which is, again, legitimate.
Yeah, let's be clear. It's not
context.
Working everywhere.
Not everywhere. Yeah. Many times it is being intertwined with anti-Semitism. But if we're talking about this day, it seems that we see the glass half full.
I'd like to go back to what Owen Alterman said at the beginning of our hour together. It is a success. I mean, Holocaust Remembrance Day has become a landmark in the universal calendar. Many countries have events, not all of them, and not all of them are as significant as in Germany. But Germany is a special case, and Germany has never denied its special role in its special responsibility, not just towards the state of Israel, but towards the remembrance of the crimes of Nazi Germany. And it fills me with hope to listen to a politician like Bell Bass, who is relatively young. She's not the older generation of feel responsible, who could be tempted, like other younger German politicians, to say, listen, yes, it was terrible, but all the perpetrators are dead, most of the survivors are dead. Let's turn the page, or let's just, lower the flames a little bit, lower the expectations from the feeling of guilt that you expect Germany to feel. It has never happened. Right. Never has a mainstream political leader in Germany shied away from the fact that the special responsibility towards Israel and the special relationship with Israel is one of the fundamental pillars of German foreign policy, along with the transatlantic relation and with the EU. It is at that level.
It's a one package. It comes together, absolutely. And in this respect, Ambassador Sheikh, I would like to turn back to our Owen Alterman. I wouldn't say in contrast of that policy, German policy that you've mentioned, but in Poland, Owen, we are seeing different sentiment to an extent, politically speaking.
Yeah, just to finish for one sec, Ellie, with Germany, going back to the speech from the head of the parliament that we heard, she made one reference, said that the culture, I'll paraphrase, the culture of remembrance that we've gotten so much praise for, it has to be transmitted to the young. And I think that really speaks to the problem of how hard it is to keep up the momentum of the intensity of the culture of remembrance 77 years on. Daniel Czech was just referencing to the voices you hear, at least on the margins in Germany, that are calling for changes and the resistance to that among the mainstream, but just how hard it's going to be over the next few decades to keep this intensity. And you're right, next door in Poland, to say the least, the government's policies have engendered more controversy. Government that has decided that this issue of the Holocaust is an issue that can be used for its own political benefit. Again, trying to, in its mind, defend Poland's good name against attacks from the outside. And again, the debate is so tired, Ellie. On one hand, everyone agrees that individual Poles committed crimes during the Holocaust, including the government. On the other hand, everyone agrees that the Polish state is not responsible. It didn't essentially exist, certainly not on the territory of Poland during the war. And then this vexing question of whether the Polish nation is responsible for the Holocaust. I'm not sure how on earth one would come to an answer to that question. Certainly it shouldn't be the object of legislation as it has been. Then we've also seen over the course of the past year this question about restitution for Holocaust property and the law that the Poles have passed. So certainly Holocaust memory distortion or alleged distortion of Holocaust memory may not be controversial in Germany, but they certainly are in other parts of Europe. Poland is not the only place. There have been controversies in places like Lithuania and Ukraine. You ask experts, and they say the situation in those countries may be even more serious than it is in Poland, even if Poland has gotten more attention. So certainly this issue of Holocaust memory, while in Germany it is a matter of consensus, we're seeing that before our eyes on the screen. Obviously, the idea of remembering the Holocaust is a consensus everywhere, but exactly what should be remembered and how and who is responsible has become the subject of intense debate.
And speaking of that topic, exactly, Owen, it's part of the events today. We're seeing a massive campaign flooding the streets of Poland, saying this is not a story, this is history. This campaign by the Chasdei Naomi organization, which supports Holocaust survivors, was kept under the radar until its big unveiling, using deep fake technology to highlight the dangers of falsification of reality, aimed at awakening Holocaust remembrance in light of the attempt of Poland, of the government to deny its part in the atrocities. And we are seeing Israeli Parliament Speaker Miki Levy taking the podium in Berlin and at the German Parliament there. Let's take a listen.
גברתי נשיאת הבונדסטאג, הגברת בס, אדוני נשיא גרמניה,
Steinmeier,
אדוני קנצלר גרמניה,
Scholz,
גברתי שורדת השואה,
Inge Auerbacher, Tochter meines Volkes, Überlebende des Holocaust, verehrte Ehrengäste, Besucher, werte Damen und Herren, zutiefst bewegt und voller Demut stehe ich heute am Internationalen Holocaust-Tag vor Ihnen, am Tag des Gedenkens.
I stand in front of you today, excited and humbled, on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Den Staat Israel.
I am proud to represent the Jewish state, the only Jewish democratic state in the world, the state of Israel. In my role as Parliament Speaker, the beating heart of Israeli democracy. The beginning, I would like to thank you, Bundestag Chairwoman, Ms. Bass, for inviting me to take part of this plenary session on this day, the day in which the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp was liberated. Universal Remembrance Day, the horrific atrocities, the most horrific atrocities in human history. Here of all places, at this historic building, the German parliament, you can comprehend even a bit the ability of humankind to utilize democracy in order to beat it. This is a place where humanity has stretched the borders of evil, a place where the loss of values have turned the democratic infrastructure into a discriminatory, racist regime. So here of all places, between the walls of this house, standing in stone and still, we learn anew how fragile is democracy, and we are called once again to protect it of all guards.
Verehrte Damen und Herren, das Angedenken an den Holocaust wachzuhalten.
Dear crowd, maintaining the memory of the Holocaust is a heavy task, a task which stands upon every generation. In commemorating the events of the past, the horrific events of the past, to the next generations. Often, the memory of the Holocaust deals with numbers, big numbers, statistics, unprecedented statistics. But can you even comprehend such a number as 6 million? The rule of big numbers adds a layer of alienation to an extent that is unjust towards the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust when it narrows their humanity level into numbers. 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. There are also 6 million stories of life that could have been stories of those who are gone. So I am full of gratitude to you, Ms. Inga Auerbacher, for creating this human voice, standing out, unique in the description and molding of Holocaust memory, a voice which defines the strength of a human story, to carve hearts, to infiltrate any perception, to demonstrate or portray the message. Otherwise, it is incomprehensible that a child that was only 7 years old before she was taken to a concentration camp. It is inconceivable taking from a child her childhood, her family, her humanity. Thank you, Inga. Thank you for succeeding in conveying the incomprehensible into a vital, vivid memory. Thank you for sharing with us and with the world your personal, touching story for the memory of the Holocaust in future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, the decisions that changed Inga's life were made 80 years and 7 days ago, not far away, in Villa Vanze. When I stood yesterday in front of this glorious villa, I was stunned. I felt the incomprehensible gap between the beautiful scenery of flowers and lakes in the background to the cruelty that was planned at this place, this destruction mechanism of European Jewry. Vanze conference, a chilling conference, was aimed at coordinating all the different tentacles of this supermission of the Nazi regime to completely diminish any memory of the Jewish people, massacring and destruction well planned ahead based on fearless hatred that are committed in a clear mechanism by a regime that was formed in a legal, democratic fashion. 80 years and 7 days that are a blink of an eye in terms of history. And opposing that
Neben der Erinnerung steht,
the wounds cannot be healed. Many are still carrying the scars that will not heal, some that will never fade away.
Trauma herauszuerheben, mit Mut und Entschlossenheit etwas Neues.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, the memory is binding us, our nations, the Israeli and the German, alongside the memory, the strength. In 80 years and 7 days, we've succeeded, both nations, to stand anew, to emerge from the trauma, the national historic trauma, and build ourselves anew courageously and peacefully. Two nations that between the death and life choose every day. They choose life. Two nations that have been through a remarkable journey on the way to peace and foundation of ties and strong friendship between us. Germany and Israel build a bridge, seeing eye to eye the strength of democracy and its importance, alongside the necessity to work together to protect it again and again, day in, day out. We have engraved and promoted ties between the nations in culture and art, technology and innovation, trade, research and development, medicine, science and academy. We've created cooperation of security and intelligence, cooperation that are deep and profound between our parliaments. Germany took upon itself the responsibility to the security of Israel. It's one of the pillars of German foreign policy. Germany stands strong in face of anti-Semitism, even when they emerge as anti-Zionism. Germany proves time and again on the bilateral arena and on the international arena as one. Its commitment, its moral obligation, historic obligation to the existence and security of the State of Israel. We have built relationship of trust, honesty, solidarity, and mutual interest that are facilitating or allowing us to stand together in face of the mutual challenges between the countries and also in face of humanity as a whole. These challenges, like dealing with a raging corona pandemic on all its variants and with a climate crisis knocking on our door, threatening our future and the future of the universe. On all of this, I wish to thank again outgoing German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who just concluded his reign, long-standing reign, which solidified the strength of Germany and did it tirelessly and worked rather tirelessly for the relationship between our countries. Dignitaries, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the State of Israel trusts you and knows that you will continue in this long-standing decade and that together we will continue to do more
Herr Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz
for the ties between the countries and between the nations.
sich auf Sie und weiß, dass Sie diese langjährige Tradition fortsetzen werden, dass wir gemeinsam weiter an den Beziehungen zwischen den Staaten und Völkern arbeiten werden.
Ladies and gentlemen,
so viel wir bereits getan haben,
as much as we have done, the responsibility to do more still lies upon us. That we are committed
menschlicher Ewigkeit
to remember, to secure commemoration for the future, for the eternity of mankind. But alongside the memory, we are also required to build a vision out of it,
jungen Menschen zusammenbringen,
to look at the hope and plan together a future, relying on mutual values and mutual dreams, to connect and empower the younger generation, our grandchildren and grandchildren, the third and fourth generation and generations to come after them, to direct them, to connect between the powers and brains, to promote a future full of inspiration, a future based on the values of democracy, of liberty, of tolerance, of freedom, which Israel and Germany share. To infuse into the young men and women the kindness in mankind, to warn them of hatred just because someone is different, to convey this eternal warning of the Jewish Holocaust in Europe. Never again. Dear ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago in 7 days, the Jewish people were facing alienation. Since then, we have seen the rise of our people, of our nation, of the state of Israel. Today we ask to remember, to always remember, and to build together a future. A moment before I conclude, I would like to raise the memory of those who passed away here at this place. I will read a part from the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for their soul. I will read it out of a Jewish Siddur, a Jewish prayer notebook that was lended to me from the Holocaust Museum of Yad Vashem, especially for this day. It was used by a German youngster in his bar mitzvah celebrations on October 22nd, 1938, a minute before the Kristallnacht events, before the life he destined to live got shattered by the reality in Germany. This prayer book, which stood still like those walls of stone and steel in this building in face of the atrocities of the Holocaust.
ב-22 באוקטובר 1938, רגע לפני פרעות נובמבר 38 הידועות כליל הבדולח. רגע לפני שהחיים אותם נועד לחיות התנפצו אל מול מציאות בגרמניה. סידור זה, אשר עמד דומם בדומה לקירות האבן האלה, הקירות האבן והפלדה בבניין הזה, אל מול זוועות השואה. תפילת קדיש על ישראל.
The prayer.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמה תברך קירותה, וימליך מלכותה, ויצמח פורקנה, ויקרב משיחה, בחיי חון וביום חון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא ברחמיו יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל, ואמרו אמן. תודה רבה.
Well.
תודה רבה לכם. תודה.
Thank you all very much. Wow. Wow, what can I say? Little words, if any. What an emotional speech, an emotional ending with the hug there at the end between Parliament Speaker and the Holocaust survivor who spoke before him. This special plenary session is about to come to an end. At the same time, we're seeing multiple events throughout the globe. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid is currently in Austria participating as we speak in another ceremony taking place there with a row of local dignitaries. Daniel Sheck, we've been watching the ceremony for the past hour or so. I can say that I'm a bit hopeful when we're talking about the memory of the Holocaust and the legacy. We can only hope will resonate into policy.
Yes, it's a tremendous moment, and it shows that not everything is just politics and international affairs. There's human dimension and there's emotion, and Miki Levy delivered a speech that maybe in its content is the obvious speech that an Israeli political leader on German soil in the Bundestag will hold. But the human dimension of Miki Levy elevated this moment into something very, very out of the ordinary. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for it, for not shying away from showing emotion. And he left a huge impression, I think, on the crowd there.
I second the sentiment, and sometimes the obvious needs to be said, and no need to be innovative or to look for novelties. Sometimes to talk about what exists.
You know, I'm sorry, but I will add another personal note. As you may know, my father was a diplomat himself. He was one of the founders of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and a survivor of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. And he volunteered to join the Israeli delegation for the establishment of diplomatic relations with Germany.
Wow.
An extremely courageous thing to do. Right. And when he was asked about it, he said, I didn't go there in order to pardon the Germans or, God forbid, to forget. I went there because you can't change what is written on the pages of history, but you can fill the empty pages of the future with something better than the past.
Wow.
And I think what we saw today, in a sense, is an incarnation of what he had hoped for.
The full pages of the past and the empty pages of the future. What a sentence, and definitely what a brave move on behalf of your father, again, to go back to this place and build the future. Thank you very much for sharing this with us, Ambassador Sheck. Owen, kind of speechless right now. Any thoughts as we conclude this special broadcast here shortly?
Yeah, Ellie, we see moment after moment of German post-Holocaust culture, ceremony after ceremony. Who can forget, by the way, the 3 foreign ministers just a few years ago, the Israeli, German, and Emirati foreign ministers, making a visit to a Holocaust memorial in Berlin. But here is another one. And just when you think there's nothing more that you can learn and you see that speech by Miki Levy, and Daniel Sheck put it beautifully. Again, the text was the standard text that one would expect an occasion like this, but Daniel Sheck so beautifully said, filled with a sense of emotion. We also should remember this was the building, Ellie, the very building that the Nazis, let's say the Nazis, burned down in 1933. Assisting in their rise to power, and literally what was burned down has risen up with the reunification of Germany in 1990, and now has been enlivened, if you will, with this ceremony, a ceremony remembering death but also affirming life. And again, those pages of history being filled with the text that we've seen today, with the notes we're hearing again on our screen, with the words of the Kaddish, that Aramaic prayer, and if I'm not mistaken, Ellie, the words of the angels, in a sense, being brought down and put into life in that very building in Berlin. Another poignant memory, another poignant moment in the post-Holocaust trajectory of Germany and of Israel together, as Miki Levy said.
Together, indeed. Thank you, Owen. Polina Garayev for us in Berlin. In the brief time we have, still a long row of ceremonies ahead. What are the highlights still ahead of us?
Well, I don't think that we'll hear or see something as emotional and impactful as both the speech by Inga Auerbacher and, of course, that powerful moment by Miki Levy. But we will, of course, hear the word Holocaust being mentioned multiple times today and also in the coming days. And, of course, we can't forget the challenges. This is something that Owen already mentioned. It's still an ongoing struggle to remember the Holocaust, to convince the young generation that even though they don't feel responsible for the crimes of the Holocaust, they do have a responsibility to remember and to most importantly search for where those lessons can be implemented in their own lives and their own reality. And specifically when we're talking about the criticism of Israel and how that intersects with the memory of the Holocaust, that is definitely an ongoing challenge. And we've seen this the past summer during the escalation in the Gaza Strip, where alongside demonstrations against Israel, we also saw attacks on synagogues. We saw calls death to the Jews. This is something that Germany is still dealing with, and not always successfully.
Yes, still many challenges ahead, but again, I think we can all derive some hope from today's event in the Bundestag. Polina Garav in Berlin, Owen Altman in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for this. And Ambassador Daniel Sheck would once again like to sincerely thank you for sharing your insights.